Let's get one thing straight: if you hear a mysterious 5-second beep in space and no one's pressing any buttons, it's either a glitch, a ghost, or a very punctual alien trying to RSVP to dinner. NASA picked glitch, but Harold J. Belton, junior communications tech out of Houston, would have picked ghost if he hadn't quit, shredded his badge, and driven to Maine the next morning to open a bookstore called Nothing Ever Happens Here. This all started on July 20th, 1969, the night Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. The world cheered, and your dad made that tired joke about walking to the fridge being harder. But back on Earth, in a cramped little booth inside NASA's Mission Audio Monitoring Division, one tech noticed a tiny hiccup in the transmission. At timestamps 02:34:17 UTC, between "that's one small step" and the triumphant silence, there was a beep, not the normal telemetry chirps. This one had reverb and tonal depth. Engineers called it a bleed. Belton called it a voice. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you're still awake, let me know your location and local time in the comments. I like to know where my insomniacs are hiding. Now, how many weird beeps does it take before NASA starts pretending they didn't hear it? Or, as Harold once said, "The moon's beautiful, but I wouldn't buy real estate there. Too many tenants already." The audio logs were crisp, legendary. Even millions of people have heard the words "Tranquility Base" here. The Eagle has landed, but no one remembers what came immediately after. That's because in the master file, there's a soft editing mark, a smoothing filter. It hides exactly 5 seconds of unexplainable sound. The engineers assumed radio interference, or maybe the LM's equipment squealing. But Belton, reviewing raw Channel 2B logs the next day, heard something deeper, a layered harmonic sequence almost like a language, but not one any Rosetta Stone CD could help with. He ran a spectrogram analysis, not because he was paranoid, but because it was boring that day, and someone had left a donut on his workstation, and he was feeling philosophical. The readout showed a repeating pattern, 6 tonal spikes at 200 Hz intervals, followed by a long pulse that almost resembled a question mark. He sent the data to a guy he knew at Caltech. The guy sent back 2 words: "That's not feedback." Meanwhile, up on the moon, Buzz Aldrin swore he saw a glint of something like metal on the horizon. He later clarified it was probably the sun catching on something. But in his post-mission debrief, he reportedly used the words "unexpected reflection." That phrase triggered a mild security audit. Here's a true fact: NASA had, and still has, a set of euphemisms for weird phenomena in space. Unexpected reflection means saw something shiny that shouldn't be there. Anomalous resonance means something hummed and we can't find it. And non-causal signal event. That's the nice way of saying someone heard a noise before the thing that made it happened. Harold, meanwhile, kept listening. The night after the moon landing, he went back to his desk, opened the backup reels, and found something no one else had a single instance, buried under transmission static, where the mysterious beep was followed by a tiny echo. 3 syllables. A whisper. Maybe his mind was filling in the gaps. But he heard it. It said, "Do not answer." Was it the astronaut's own words, bounced back strangely by the moon's surface? Or was it something else? The moon, after all, has no atmosphere. It doesn't echo. It doesn't hum. And it certainly doesn't whisper. The philosophical debate this triggered in Harold's brain, shortly before he left to sell paperbacks and burn sage, was this: can something be real if only one person hears it? If a voice speaks from space and no one believes you, is it still a warning or just a malfunction with good timing? He filed one report. It was quietly archived and marked "Operator Fatigue Non-Actionable." A week later, Someone from NASA security dropped by Harold's desk, not to reprimand him, not even to ask questions, just to leave a sealed envelope with the initials JY and a post-it that read, "Good ears. Don't dig." Of course, Harold did dig. For about 3 days. Then he gave away all his Beatles records, sold his car, and drove to a foggy part of Maine where the radio never quite works right. Some say he still listens. Others say he's gone full tinfoil and speaks to pigeons. But one thing's clear. He never worked another space-related job again. And that 5-second beep, it showed up again. Twice. Once during Apollo 12, and again during Apollo 17. Always at the exact same timestamp relative to touchdown. NASA eventually replaced the onboard comm modules with a new frequency buffer. Officially, to reduce static. Unofficially, to silence a pattern they couldn't explain. Years later, a graduate student researching signal entropy discovered the pattern again in old Voyager probe data. The same tone spikes, the same pulsing question mark. She built a simple model and let it run overnight. At 3:12 a.m., it spat out 3 words as the best possible English translation of the signal. They were "We see you." The academic debate that followed mostly centered around whether AI translation models could generate meaning from meaningless input. But a smaller, quieter community, mostly composed of retired radio technicians and aging astronauts, had a different take. Maybe it's not about translation at all. One of them said, maybe it's about listening to what we were never meant to hear. To understand why breathing in space is terrifying, you need to appreciate 2 facts. There is no air. There should be no breathing sounds coming from the walls. And yet, during the Skylab 4 mission in 1974, a whispering, rhythmic breath kept cycling through the audio channels like a particularly antisocial wind chime. It wasn't one of the astronauts. It wasn't ground control. And it sure as hell wasn't supposed to sound tired. Now, breathing isn't new to astronauts. They do it all the time. The suits record it. The mics transmit it. But what makes this case interesting is that the sound didn't belong to any of the living humans on board. The 3-man Skylab 4 crew, Gibson, Carr, and Pogue, logged 84 days aboard the orbiting science lab. That's 84 days of sleep, exercise, and more dehydrated chili than is medically advisable. They also logged a number of unusual noises, mostly brushed off by mission control as pressure valve fluctuations, which is NASA's way of saying, yeah, we heard it too, and we are deeply pretending we didn't. One night, around day 23, the audio records picked up a slow, steady inhale, exhale, just beneath the surface of the comms chatter. It was faint, but not background faint. No, this was deliberate breathing, and it didn't match any of the crew's oxygen feed patterns. Their vitals were stable. Nobody was asleep. Nobody was unaccounted for. And here's the kicker. The breathing stopped every time someone spoke, like it was listening. The engineers blamed a feedback loop through the water filtration system, because obviously, the best explanation for ghost breath is bad plumbing. But when they ran a control test using the same hardware on Earth, the sound didn't return. No breathing, no feedback. Just the hum of bored scientists wondering why their careers had led them to listening to imaginary space ghosts wheeze through ductwork. Meanwhile, Carr started logging what he called involuntary auditory events. Basically, he kept hearing his own name whispered back to him through his headset. Except it wasn't his own voice, or Gibson's, or Pogue's. The first time it said Carr, he ignored it. The second time, it added, "Don't turn around." Here's the fun part. Skylab didn't have room to turn around. It was barely the size of a New York studio apartment. So when you hear something behind you in zero gravity and there's literally nothing there, your brain starts filing panic reports with the cosmic HR department. NASA issued an official statement. No anomalous sounds or environmental deviations were recorded beyond expected equipment functions. which is bureaucratic shorthand for please stop asking about the space ghosts. Our lawyers are tired. But the breathing sound wasn't confined to one mission. Flash forward to STS-61 in 1993, Hubble repair mission, 5 astronauts, 1 telescope, and about $100 million in loose wires and stress-induced nausea. During a routine maintenance check, Commander Dick Cova asked about a low-frequency growl that had been coming through the communications deck. His words, "It sounds like a scuba diver with bronchitis." It wasn't recorded in the transcript, but it was written in a margin note in blue pen. Compare to Skylab anomaly. Ask Bev. No one knows who Bev was. Her name doesn't appear on the mission staff. The note was scribbled in the mission log and quietly redacted in later copies. One NASA archivist, decades later, found a folder labeled BSC, Audio Incursions, Do Not Replicate. Inside were 14 different waveform patterns of the breathing event spanning missions from the 1970s through 2002. Different frequencies, different timings, but all unmistakably human breath. Except, some of them were reversed, and when played backward, one sounded eerily like speech. A private acoustic analyst who reviewed the files later published a short, anonymous paper theorizing that some of the anomalies may represent a paralinguistic intrusion from a post-causal auditory channel, which is a polite way of saying space might echo things that haven't happened yet. That's the philosophical debate still swirling in weird corners of acoustic science, whether space, as a medium, can store intention or pre-event noise. Some call it nonsense, others call it theater for physicists. A few call it quantum compression, and those people tend to have unbrushed hair and too many magnets on their refrigerators. Quirk Alert NASA once gave the nickname Wheezy to a thermal panel on Skylab because it emitted a sound similar to breathing during pressurization tests. Unfortunately, Wheezy never breathed in rhythm with the astronauts. The Space Ghost did. As a side note, you'll appreciate that during all this, the crew had a favorite snack, tang mixed with cinnamon sugar. Disgusting, ka. Yeah, but in zero gravity, flavor options are limited, and astronauts get creative, especially when haunted. Back to Skylab, one final oddity. On day 79, all 3 astronauts reported simultaneous lucid dreams about drowning. Not floating, not crashing, drowning. On a space station. In orbit, where there is no water. Carr later described the dream in vivid detail, noting the feeling of pressure on his chest, like someone breathing into his lungs from the outside. NASA wrote it off as a psychological stress symptom, but in his private journal, Carr wrote something different. Felt watched, not malevolent, just tired. Like we woke it up. That journal was found decades later in a storage unit auctioned off in Houston. It's currently held by a collector of space memorabilia who claims he still hears static when he leaves it open too long. So maybe the real question isn't, what were the astronauts hearing? Maybe it's, what was finally hearing them back? The thing about space is that it's supposed to be quiet. That's the deal. No air, no sound, no uninvited linguistics. So when a Gemini astronaut starts speaking fluent Spanish in his sleep and doesn't speak Spanish when awake people start to fidget, and by people, I mean flight surgeons, linguists, and one poor transcript typist named Marlene, who still refuses to attend bilingual weddings. It was Gemini 10, 1966, John Young and Michael Collins, a clean, successful mission by all accounts, except for the part where Collins' mid-rest cycle began mumbling into his headset. Not unusual. Astronauts talk in their sleep more than you'd expect. What was unusual was that the mumbling was clear, consistent, and grammatically perfect Castilian Spanish. Collins was from Rome, Georgia, fluent in English, adequate in sarcasm. Definitely not a secret Spaniard. The transcripts were flagged by a comms tech who had studied abroad in Salamanca and recognized the dialect immediately. At first, they thought it was a prank. Maybe Young was messing with him. But the voice was Collins, And the phrases weren't just idle nonsense. One translated roughly to "tomorrow's eclipse is not the end." Another, "they buried the ship beneath the ocean and forgot." Let me remind you, Gemini 10 launched in July 1966. There was no solar eclipse that month. But exactly 1 year later, on July 20th, 1967, a total eclipse passed over the Pacific, and a Soviet submarine carrying nuclear payloads sank within the path of totality. This is real. Look up the K-129 incident. Classified, covered up for decades, and strangely relevant to something Collins would never have known. When asked about the sleep talk post-mission, Collins looked genuinely confused. He claimed to have had vivid dreams, but couldn't remember details. Except one, I was walking through a field of satellites. They were growing like flowers. NASA, naturally, attributed the Spanish to possible subconscious memory artifacts. They even checked to see if Collins had ever watched a telenovela in college. He hadn't. But he had once walked past a Spanish class on the way to calculus. So that was apparently close enough to explain spontaneous multilingual prophecy. There's a deeper, ongoing philosophical argument tied to this. Can the human brain process information it has never been exposed to? Could dreams serve as some kind of shared memory field, tuned through stress, isolation, or perhaps orbital altitude? One Stanford neuroanthropologist once suggested that extreme isolation in zero gravity can activate latent linguistic frameworks the brain retains from prenatal stimuli, which is a fancy way of saying maybe space makes your brain pick up the neighbor's Wi-Fi. Or the universes. What makes this even weirder is that Collins wasn't the only one. In 1981, during STS-2 astronaut Joe Engle reportedly muttered in ancient Greek in iambic pentameter while asleep on the middeck. The audio is scratchy, but the cadence was verified by a classics professor who said it loosely resembled the Iliad, except with references to wings of flame and skies made of teeth. NASA did not follow up. Instead, they changed the sleep mic protocols to only record when astronauts were actively communicating, because what you don't hear can't cause a PR incident. Quirky aside, the Gemini capsule's microphone system was so sensitive that it once picked up a heartbeat from a technician on the launch pad while the hatch was still open. He was reportedly listening to James Brown and trying not to pass out. Back to a Spanish-speaking Collins. One particular phrase still confuses linguists. He said, "Ellos vendrán por el último reflejo." Translated, they will come for the last reflection. Reflection of what? Light thought history, or the crew. Later analyses showed that just hours before that utterance, the capsule passed through an unusually dense particle field, unexpected and unexplained by mission control. Instruments flickered. One camera captured a single frame of what appears to be a crescent-shaped object in the black. Not a satellite. Not a star. Just one isolated silver arc there and gone. It wasn't logged. It wasn't examined. But a copy was quietly placed into the private collection of flight director Gene Kranz under a handwritten note, Gemini 10 mirror contact. That phrase, mirror contact, shows up 3 more times in internal NASA memos from the 1960s through the 80s. It's never defined, but it's always associated with sudden signal distortion, unexplained echoes, and, in 2 cases, temporary short-term memory loss in mission control personnel. Which brings us back to Collins' last recorded phrase before he awoke. No one remembers the second son. Nobody knows what he meant. But if you've read the Voynich manuscript or, like me, skimmed the Reddit theories about it at 2 a.m. with a spicy burrito, you'll recognize a similar line appears in a 15th century diagram of dual solar paths. Coincidence? Probably. But coincidences pile up like weird little breadcrumbs, and eventually someone builds a haunted sandwich. Years later, when Collins was asked about his Gemini experience during a lecture, he laughed it off. "I don't remember dreaming in Spanish," he said. "But if I did, I hope I was charming." Then, just before walking off stage, he reportedly muttered under his breath, El reflejo ya viene. The reflection is already coming. There are a lot of things you expect to see while floating in orbit. Earth, stars, maybe a floating cheese puff if someone got lazy with the vacuum tube. What you don't expect to see is yourself, especially if you're still inside the ship and the other you is outside, silent, watching, and notably not connected to any kind of oxygen supply. Welcome to what mission logs refer to, with impressive understatement, as the Gemini doppelganger incident. It happened during Gemini 7, 1965. Astronaut Frank Borman was completing a routine visual check during orbit. He was strapped in, calm, monitoring his external view. Then, according to the flight log, he froze mid-sentence and said, "There's someone outside." The capsule had no scheduled EVAs. Both astronauts were accounted for. Yet Borman insisted he saw a suited figure floating several meters from the window, motionless, facing the craft. Jim Lovell, his crewmate, checked the monitor. Nothing. Just darkness and Earth's shadow. But Borman wouldn't drop it. "He's got no tether," he said. "No backpack. No face." In post-mission interviews, Borman described the figure in more detail. "It looked like me," he said. "Same suit, same visor scratches, even the same little smudge where I dropped my pen on the checklist." He wasn't claiming it was an illusion. He knew it was impossible, but he also swore it was real. NASA attributed it to space fatigue, a polite way of saying, "You probably just saw a reflection, and your brain had a little dance party with it." But Borman had been alert, well-fed, and not on any medications. His vitals showed no spikes, his O2 levels were perfect, and most importantly, he was known for being boring, the kind of guy who never exaggerated. His nickname in training, Missionary Frank. One technician on the comms team suggested a lens flare. Another, off the record, suggested something called visual field overlay hallucination, a phenomenon where your brain creates an image over darkness to compensate for too little sensory input. A third, not joking, said or maybe he saw the guy who's going to replace him. Here's the odd part. The capsule recorded a brief static pulse just after Borman's sighting. A pulse shaped like an inverted heartbeat, exactly the inverse of a human ECG reading. It lasted 1.3 seconds. When mapped onto a visual spectrogram, it formed a shape loosely resembling a human silhouette, kneeling. Quirky fact of the day, astronauts used to bring small personal items into space for luck. Borman's was a cheap silver pocket mirror. After the doppelganger incident, he refused to touch it again. He asked it be left in the capsule. NASA returned it to him anyway. 2 years later, during Apollo 8, that same mirror went missing en route to the moon. Never seen again. Now, let's get philosophical. There's an old debate in cognitive science about identity recursion. If you were to perceive yourself from an external, identical point of view, how would your brain react recognition or rejection? A few fringe theorists have applied this to what's known as the observer paradox in deep space conditions. The idea that the act of observation itself, under specific isolation thresholds, may create a localized quantum feedback loop. Translation: if you stare into the void long enough, and the void really wants a friend, it might just send a knockoff version of you to say hi. Of course, that sounds ridiculous, until you remember that, decades later, the James Webb Space Telescope recorded what appeared to be a mirrored twin of our solar system, a perfect inversion of planet positions located 14 billion light-years away. Scientists call it a lensing artifact, but the fun folks call it our cosmic reflection. Back to Borman, years after his retirement. He gave a talk at a university. The topic was Leadership and Safety Protocols in Early Spaceflight, which is code for how not to die in a floating tin can. During the Q&A, a student asked him directly about the doppelganger incident. He paused, smiled, then said, "If you ever see yourself in space, ask who they're expecting to come back." That line ended up in a Reddit thread that's now 47,000 comments deep. Some believe the incident was a visual metaphor. Others think it's proof of a parallel observer layer, the idea that consciousness might echo, ripple-like, through gravitational thresholds. One user suggested the figure was a warning, like those birds that fly into windows before a storm. Another claimed it's common in isolation scenarios and referenced a similar case from the 1950s Antarctic expeditions, where a researcher saw his double in the snow, pointing at the ice beneath him, moments before a crevasse opened. Creeped out yet. Here's one last twist. In 1972, during Apollo 17, astronaut Harrison Schmitt reported a moment during orbit where his visor fogged unexpectedly. When he wiped it, he claimed he saw, briefly, another face, not my own. Then it was gone. No one followed up. Probably because by then, NASA had developed a protocol known unofficially as echo events, unexplained visual or auditory anomalies, that were to be logged, but not investigated, unless they affected mission integrity. That policy's still quietly active. The next time you're lying awake at night, wondering what's up there, remember this space doesn't just contain stars and planets. It contains memory, echoes, possibilities, and, if you're lucky, or unlucky, a second version of you who maybe got there first. There's something particularly unnerving about being watched. It's a human thing, eyes in the dark, a creaky floorboard, a feeling in your spine like someone standing just outside your peripheral vision with an opinion about your haircut. Now imagine feeling that on the far side of the moon while floating in a tin can with no one around for 855 miles. During Apollo 16's orbit around the moon in 1972, astronauts John Young and Charles Duke were passing over the lunar far side when something unexpected happened. Their comms cut out. Again, not unusual radio blackouts were a known factor on the far side, due to the moon itself blocking signals. The strange part was what came back through the channel when the signal resumed. It wasn't static, it was a voice, and it didn't sound like any of the astronauts or Houston. Here's how the log went. It was recorded on backup channel C, a rarely used audio track meant for troubleshooting. 02, 1732, UTC, static. 02, 1733 UTC, whispering noise. 02, 1734 UTC, a voice, female. Very faint. We see her too. That's it. That's the whole line. But it chilled every tech who heard it to the marrow. We see her too. What woman? And who is we? The engineers did what engineers do. They ran diagnostics, checked for interference, blamed solar wind and rogue signal reflections. One technician, off the record, simply said, "It wasn't an echo. I don't know what it was, but it knew when to speak." Here's the historical twist Charles Duke later admitted in an interview that during the same orbit, he thought he saw something move inside one of the moon's deep craters. Something reflective. Tall. Like a silhouette holding a lamp, he said, before quickly backpedaling and blaming the angle of the sun. But the phrase "we see her too" started to circulate within the mission audio group. It was never acknowledged in public documents, but in internal chatter, it became a sort of ghost story. So let's talk about the her. In 1958, a Soviet probe, Luna 2, crashed on the moon. Officially, that was the end of the story. Unofficially, Luna 2 had carried an experimental data recorder and, according to a few declassified Russian memos, a symbolic engraving of a woman with a sword, a folk deity of protection. The USSR never explained why. Then, in 1994, a private observatory in Chile captured a shadow anomaly in Mare Moscoviense, a patch of lunar surface on the far side, during a full moon cycle. The shadow remained static across 3 nights. Despite changing light angles, amateur astronomers nicknamed it the Lady in the Window, Azuzar, a poetic name, sure, until it seemed to answer. Because when Apollo 16's data was reanalyzed decades later by a university project, that whisper. We see her too, showed up in a different location on the waveform, hidden behind standard telemetry, layered in like an audio watermark, only noticeable when run through deep spectral inversion. Now here's your required quirky fact. NASA once printed 500 commemorative mugs with the phrase, "Houston, we have a coffee problem," after the Apollo 13 mission. One of those mugs mysteriously appeared on an intern's desk in 2013, despite being out of circulation for 40 years. No shipping records, no sender, just the phrase scrawled on the bottom in Sharpie. We see her too. That intern now runs a weather balloon company in New Mexico and refuses to talk to journalists. Now, the big academic debate here isn't about ghosts or moon ladies. It's about perceptual contagion. That's the idea that certain phrases or images, once introduced to a closed system, can replicate and mutate through suggestion alone. Did someone seed "We see her too" into the transcripts later? Is this just a prank that snowballed through Cold War paranoia? Or, and stay with me here, what if the moon isn't just a rock? What if it's a kind of mirror? A place that reflects not light, but attention. The moon has been a symbol of femininity, madness, and prophecy in every major culture. Even the word lunatic derives from it. Ancient Babylonian astronomers believed the moon was hollow and contained the memory of every living thing. A ridiculous belief unless you've ever listened to 1970s lunar comms at 3 a.m. and heard a woman's voice whispering from the wrong side of the silence. Charles Duke, by the way, retired and became a motivational speaker. He tells stories about space, about teamwork, about achieving goals. But he never talks about the crater, or the silhouette, or the whisper, except once. At a small aerospace event in Huntsville, he was asked half-jokingly if he saw any aliens up there. He chuckled and said, "No aliens," then paused. "But I'll say this: if you ever look out the window and see something looking back, close the blinds. Some things aren't ready to be remembered." The cosmos is full of polite mysteries. Stars dying quietly, light bending gently around things it can't explain. But then, there's the Black Night. Not the Monty Python one, though. Oddly similar in terms of refusing to go away. In 1998, while the Space Shuttle Endeavour was finishing a routine mission, a strange object was seen and photographed orbiting Earth, not listed in any satellite registry, not matching any known debris, dark, irregular, and moving like it had somewhere to be. NASA said it was a thermal blanket that came loose during an EVA. But people who examined the photographs said, "Yeah, okay, but why is the blanket sending Morse code?" Because that's what it did. For 6 hours after the visual confirmation, 3 separate amateur radio operators, one in Norway, one in Argentina, one in Australia, reported receiving bursts of Morse code on an unused frequency, synced to the object's path overhead. The message: "Awake earlier than expected." Then it stopped. NASA, understandably, avoided commenting. The official line was "no known transmission," which is a classic space agency non-denial. Meanwhile, on a back channel, someone leaked the internal nickname for the object, the satellite that called first. Here's a very real, very historical fact. In 1927, decades before Sputnik engineer Jürgen Hals in Norway detected long-delayed radio echoes bouncing back from space seconds after transmission. No one knew what caused them. Some scientists proposed ionospheric reflection. Others proposed, well, a listener. The delay patterns didn't match known physics. Some theorists claimed the intervals corresponded to coordinates specifically, star charts, and those star charts pointed to Epsilon Bootis, a star 217 light-years away. Coincidence? Probably. But that hasn't stopped conspiracy theorists from calling it the Epsilon Bootis probe. The thing is, this strange Black Knight object keeps showing up. First reported in the 1950s by a U.S. Navy radar technician who logged an unknown polar orbiting satellite. At the time, no one had satellites in polar orbit. Soviet tech couldn't manage it. American engineers didn't believe it was physically possible yet, so either the Navy radar had a hiccup, or someone got there first. Fast forward to Endeavour in 1998. The object is captured on multiple cameras. It changes orientation mid-orbit, something a free-floating blanket doesn't do. It shadows the shuttle for a full orbit before drifting out of range. And then, on the ground, signals start up again. A technician at Jodrell Bank Observatory in the UK picks up a weak signal on an abandoned UHF band. It repeats 3 numbers: 1960, 1972, 2019. All 3 are years of significant lunar or orbital anomalies. In 1960, NORAD tracked an unknown object that vanished mid-sky. In 1972, Apollo 17 recorded seismic readings on the Moon, hours after leaving something hit the lunar surface. Hard. In 2019, India's Vikram lander crashed during its final descent, and the last transmission it sent included an unintelligible burst of binary that hasn't been decoded to this day. The academic debate this triggered is part of what's called the precursor hypothesis, the idea that Earth may be under passive observation by a non-human intelligence, waiting for a particular signal threshold or behavior pattern before initiating contact. Sounds sci-fi, right? But in 1973, the Arecibo Observatory broadcast a message to a globular cluster 25,000 light-years away. It included information about humanity's DNA, population, and chemical composition. The guy who helped write it, Dr. Frank Drake, once joked, "If someone's listening, they probably already know more about us than we do." Quirky side note. NASA has a semi-secret policy of naming persistent anomalies with Shakespearean code names. The Black Knight object's unofficial log title, Hamlet, as in, "There are more things in heaven and earth." Horatio? Of course, skeptics have explanations. All photos of the object, they say, are of debris. All Morse signals are coincidences. But even skeptics struggle with the fact that the object has been seen across multiple missions, multiple decades, always in polar orbit and always silent, until it's not. Here's where it gets interesting. In 2022, an amateur satellite tracker in Japan claimed to spot the object again. It had shifted orbit, which means, if true, it has some kind of propulsion. And the same week, a SETI researcher found a repeating pattern in archival data, a burst that, when translated using phonetic mapping, resembled a phrase in an ancient Sumerian dialect. The phrase, "We remember your sky." If this were a bedtime story, I'd say that was the moment the blanket tucked itself in. But this isn't a story. It's a catalog of things NASA doesn't really like talking about. The kind of things they lock in folders marked non-operational events. The kind of things that occasionally call first before we even know we're sending. Because maybe we didn't build all the satellites out there. Maybe one of them built itself. In the Cold War era, the U.S. had many secret projects. Some were brilliant, some were disasters, and some, like Project Echo, were both, officially. Echo was a series of passive communication satellites, massive, shiny mylar balloons inflated in orbit to reflect microwave transmissions. Basically, they launched giant space mirrors. What could go wrong? Well, you know how kids shine flashlights at mirrors to make shapes on the wall? Imagine doing that with classified government transmissions, except sometimes the mirror flashes back. In 1960, the Echo 1A balloon was launched into low Earth orbit. Everything went fine until it didn't. During a routine bounce test between California and Hawaii, the signal returned early, just a fraction of a second. But early. That's not supposed to happen. Light doesn't cheat. Space doesn't give refunds. Engineers chalked it up to miscalculation, until the second test. This time, the microwave signal came back before it was sent, a few milliseconds ahead of its own timestamp. That's when someone panicked and unplugged everything. Now, maybe it was a glitch. Maybe it was a sensor fault. But the guy who recorded that second signal, a 24-year-old analyst named Marcus Blythe, refused to run any more tests. He reported migraines, disorientation, and eventually a full-blown nosebleed right there at his desk. That's the quirky detail, because later that day, with 2 tissues crammed up his nostrils and a packet of saltines in his lap, Marcus calmly predicted the exact date Richard Nixon would resign, August 8th, 1974. This was in 1960. When asked how he knew, he reportedly said, "The mirror told me." Naturally, the Air Force classified the conversation. Echo wasn't a one-off. Echo 2 launched in 1964, and things got even stranger. A team in Maryland monitoring the satellite noticed what they called non-bounce return signals that arrived back even before they transmitted. Think about that. They hadn't pressed send, and the system already had a reply. One such reply was a faint, garbled audio burst that, when cleaned up, sounded like someone whistling Camptown Races in 8-bit, backward. That particular file has never been made public, but an internal memo dubbed it the Microwave Whisperers and recommended all further experiments be rerouted through less sensitive frequencies. That was government speak for let's stop poking the thing we accidentally woke up. Which brings us to the broader scientific debate. Can electromagnetic systems pick up nonlinear time data? In other words, can a signal bounce off something in orbit and come back before we send it, if that something isn't entirely playing by our physical rules? This falls under a fringe concept in physics called retrocausality. The idea that effects can precede causes under very specific quantum conditions. Most scientists don't buy it. Others say it's like arguing with your own future and losing. But if Project Echo really did pick up pre-signals, it means something in orbit was functioning like a microwave time loop, one you could accidentally dial into, like tuning an old radio and landing on a station that hasn't gone on air yet. One engineer tried to explain it away as feedback from the ionosphere. Another said, maybe it was ground interference bouncing through multiple paths, but none of them could explain the timing, or why one of the engineers, while listening to the playback loop, began repeating the phrase. I already answered this question, over and over. The guy's name was Dr. Harlan Chow. He later became a professor at MIT. One of his specialties, microwave entanglement theory, a concept so obscure that even other physicists nod politely and then back away, slowly. Here's the spooky cherry on top in 1977 during a retrospective on Project Echo. Chow gave a lecture where he explained his theory that satellites could resonate with the future under certain electromagnetic profiles. He called them echo nodes. He was laughed out of the room. 2 years later, a student reviewing echo telemetry from 1964 discovered something bizarre, a series of faint pulses hidden in the data, spaced like Morse code. The message, "Do not answer yet." That exact phrase appeared again in 1993. This time, buried in the signal logs of a classified communications balloon launched under a DARPA initiative. Different tech, different time, same phrase. So now we ask, coincidence, hoax, or a pattern hiding in plain orbit? One current theory, whispered in aerospace circles, is that certain orbital objects like large balloons or inactive satellites are acting as passive recorders for something else. Not artificial intelligence, but echo-intelligence. Something that doesn't think the way we do. Something that listens, waits, and occasionally responds. And sometimes, it responds before we even say anything. Project Echo officially ended in the 60s. But if you look hard enough, you'll find a side project spun off in the 80s, called Echo V, funded under communications infrastructure, but listed under psychological resilience training. What does that mean? No one knows, except maybe Marcus Blythe. He lives in a cabin in Montana now. No phone, no microwave. Just a mylar balloon hanging in his front yard, tied to a fence post. On it, written in permanent marker. When you hear it again, don't respond. Before we mapped Mars, someone else apparently already had. The story begins in 1959 with a young Air Force test pilot named Paul Kirchner. He was part of an early batch of Mercury astronaut hopefuls, smart, steady, and just the right amount of reckless. He didn't make the final cut, mostly because he didn't like cameras, slept too much, and once told a NASA psychologist that he sometimes dreamed in coordinates. Everyone laughed until he drew a map. According to archival notes from a psychological evaluation, Kirchner came into his third interview holding a napkin. On it, a series of crater markings, ridges, and labeled features. He called it the red side, said it was something he'd seen while sleeping, said he just knew where everything was, where. The odd part, one of the labeled features was Arzia Mons, a giant Martian volcano that wouldn't be imaged by NASA until 1972. This was 13 years earlier. Kirchner had never seen a Martian topographic map. No one had. And yet, when his sketch was recently compared to satellite imaging from the Mars Global Surveyor, 7 of the 11 features were within 5% positional accuracy. How? NASA never commented. But an internal note from the Mercury Selection Board mentioned him under non-conforming candidates' possible sleep pathology. His napkin map was filed, forgotten, and eventually thrown out, except a janitor kept a photocopy. The janitor's niece, years later, posted it online with the caption, "My uncle cleaned up astronaut trash in the 60s. What is this? The internet, predictably, exploded. Here's a true historical tidbit before any probes reached Mars. Many planetary scientists believed it would be relatively featureless. Some even suggested the canals observed in the 19th century were optical illusions. They weren't expecting volcanoes, ancient riverbeds, or signs of glaciation. Kirchner had drawn all 3. When questioned decades later, in a rare interview for a university documentary, he smiled and said, "I didn't dream it. I remembered it. That's different. Now." Most folks would call that a coincidence. The mind is good at pattern filling. Pareidolia. The tendency to see meaning in randomness is a well-documented psychological effect. But then someone checked his notes again and found coordinates scrawled in the margin 7.9 dexrags. 123 by reader. That's the location of a Martian region with an unusual mineral signature, one that still puzzles geologists because it contains a compound not found anywhere else on the planet. When Kirchner was told this, he simply replied, "That's where I used to land." Used to, whether he meant in a dream, a past life, or something else he never clarified. But in a 1963 memo from NASA's Special Research Division, an internal unit sometimes described as the department that answers questions nobody likes, someone had scribbled, "Monitor candidate. Repeating dream cycles indicate potential non-random neural interface. Translation, keep an eye on him. His brain might be tuning into something we didn't build." This touches on a fringe philosophical and scientific debate. Is memory strictly personal, or can it be collective? The concept of morphic resonance proposed by biologist Rupert Sheldrake suggests that there's a non-local memory field all life may tap into. It's controversial. It's unprovable. It's also the backbone of why some people insist they just know things they've never learned, like Paul Kirchner and his Martian doodle napkin. Quirky detail. Paul also reportedly kept a shoebox full of pocket compasses. When asked why, he said they helped him orient when the dreams started. No one asked what direction he was orienting toward. And the dreams. He described them like this: a vast, silent desert under a lavender sky. Metallic structures half buried in sand. A humming sound, constant and low. And a message that repeated over and over, though never in words. He translated it once. Poetically, "You are not first. You are not last. You are just the newest echo." That phrase shows up again in a 1984 SETI memo, after a strange burst was received from the direction of Mars' southern pole. The signal was too short to analyze. but the technician on duty claimed it reminded him of a whale calling from inside a bell. 2 weeks later, that technician resigned and became a lighthouse keeper. So what do we do with Kirchner's map? With his dreams, his volcanoes and coordinates and quiet insistence that he landed there already? Well, NASA quietly stopped discussing him. His personnel file is heavily redacted, and when a FOIA request was filed in 2009 for more information, the response was, "No relevant documents located," except one was found in an unrelated filing box by a researcher named Ellen Datt in 2015. It was a photograph of Kirchner, age 29, standing next to a model of the Mars Viking lander. On the back, written in pencil, "It's wrong. The legs should fold in." The real Viking lander did have folding legs, but that wasn't publicly disclosed until 1975. Texas. Let's get one thing straight. There is no reason carousel music should exist 250 miles above Earth. Yet in March 2001, during an otherwise unremarkable stint aboard the International Space Station, 2 astronauts reported hearing through the ventilation system. Of all places, a faint tune drifting through the modules. It sounded like a music box. No device on board the ISS was capable of producing that sound. There was no music library, no ambient playlists, not even a jingle-playing food tray, just oxygen generators, CO2 scrubbers, and enough floating toothpaste to make a small, minty cloud. The astronauts, both seasoned and stoic, initially chalked it up to cabin noise, but when the same melody returned 3 nights in a row, always at 03:12 UTC, they started writing it down. The tune it matched an old children's lullaby, popular in Eastern Europe, Spy, moje dítě. Sleep, sleep. My child. Problem is, neither of them had ever heard it before, and neither of them grew up anywhere near Eastern Europe. Here's the kicker. The melody didn't come through their headsets. It wasn't an audio file. They heard it through the walls, as if the station itself was humming. Now, the ISS is loud. It's basically a floating HVAC unit with a passport. Fans, pumps, and buzzers whir constantly. But none of those components cycle on at 03:12 UTC. None emit melodic tones, and none explain why both astronauts independently reported the exact same song, with the exact same tempo. NASA's medical team reviewed the reports and flagged isolation auditory phenomena as a possible cause. In layman's terms, space madness. But both astronauts passed their cognitive tests. No sleep deprivation, no cabin fever. Just 2 very confused professionals humming a ghost lullaby in 0 gravity. Here's a weird scientific fact. Microgravity can alter the structure of the human inner ear, which in turn affects balance and sometimes hearing. But that wouldn't explain how 2 separate people heard the same music at the same time coming from a physical source. That's where the whisper of the music box incident began to float through unofficial channels. By the 4th night, one astronaut, let's call him Commander R, got bold. He recorded ambient audio using a handheld mic. Nothing was captured, just static, background hums, and one sharp click at the same moment he noted the melody began. That click, when analyzed by audio engineers years later, showed a harmonic profile resembling the sound of, wait for it, a spring being wound. Meanwhile, the other astronaut specialist, T, reported increasingly vivid dreams. In them, he walked through the ISS corridors, but everything was made of wood, the bulkheads, the wiring, even the viewing dome. He called it the dollhouse. In one dream, he found a key under his pillow. In another, he found a tiny figure sitting at the airlock, cranking a miniature handle. He never saw its face. Quirky footnote: years earlier, during Expedition 8 in 2003, a different ISS crew member wrote in a private email that he'd woken to the sound of a tiny metal hammer tapping near his head. That email was deleted from NASA archives, but preserved in a personal backup drive recovered by his son. The file name, WindUpMan Log 5 TechTXT. This brings us to a fun philosophical corner of physics. Does space remember rhythm? A few speculative physicists have proposed that sound waves under extreme isolation and artificial ecosystems like the ISS might imprint on materials in unexpected ways. Think of it like a kind of sonic haunting, where repeated systems, noises, crew voices, or harmonics from Earth broadcasts leave acoustic residues, sort of like emotional mold. But no one on the ISS had ever played that lullaby. Unless you believe the unofficial log that surfaced in 2014 posted anonymously on a defunct Russian space blog. It claimed that during the Mir station era, cosmonauts occasionally heard soft melodies over the radio at 03:12 UTC. The songs varied, but the last one, according to the entry, was always the same. Moje dитя. And here's the creepiest part in some versions of the lullaby. There's a final verse rarely sung outside of its 18th century origin. Sleep, child, sleep. The stars will close their eyes soon. If you hear the turning key, do not rise. That final line doesn't appear in modern recordings, but it does appear verbatim in a margin note from an Apollo 17 audio tech who once flagged a strange ticking during orbit. The note was dismissed as nonsense. The technician, by the way, left aerospace work and opened a piano repair shop. The astronauts involved in the music box incident finished their mission without further anomalies. They were rotated back to Earth. But Specialist T, in a later interview, said he'd developed an aversion to ticking clocks. He removed all timepieces from his house. At night, he claimed, he could still hear the melody faintly when the refrigerator compressor kicked on. So, what was it? A shared dream. An auditory hallucination created by extreme sensory deprivation, or something older, coiled quietly in the framework of the ISS, waiting for just the right moment to hum a forgotten tune. One retired engineer had a theory. He believed that space, being silent, gets lonely. And every now and then, it borrows our music just to feel a little more human. If you ever want to see NASA get nervous, just say the words unredacted transcript. It's like whispering free snacks at a conference, but everybody looks up. In the early 1980s, a routine declassification of Apollo-era flight records resulted in an accidental release of not one, not two, but 17 pages of transcripts that were supposed to be heavily blacked out. They weren't. Oops. The documents came from Apollo 15, a mission mostly remembered for landing near Hadley Rill, and for being the one where an astronaut drove the first lunar rover like he'd stolen it. But buried in the comms logs were some very odd phrases that didn't quite match the tone of lunar geology reports. Examples. The mirror's blinking again. Stop humming. No one's humming. The stars don't line up right anymore. Now, that could all be sleep deprivation. Could be signal interference. Could be a prank. Until you get to the line that made everyone sit up and spill their tangs. Are we the dream or the dreamer? That phrase wasn't said once. It was said 3 times by different astronauts on separate missions. Apollo 12, Apollo 15, and again during a pre-landing simulation for Apollo 17. Each time, the person speaking it sounded calm, puzzled, and entirely unaware that the phrase had ever been spoken before. This leads us straight into one of the juicier debates in metaphysical science. Convergent cognition, the idea that isolated minds under identical conditions might arrive at the same thoughts without external influence. Some call it synchronicity. Others call it nonsense. One guy in a turtleneck at MIT called it shared metaphysical residue. That guy now runs a very confusing YouTube channel where he reviews microwave ovens and occasionally cries. The unredacted pages also reference something called the mirror effect. Not explained, not defined, but always accompanied by timestamps where astronauts reported feeling disoriented, unsure of direction, even unsure of whether they were inside the capsule or watching themselves inside the capsule. One entry from Apollo 15 reads, 2:31:44 UTC. Tell Jim to stop moving. 2:31:46 UTC. Jim's not moving. 2:31:47 UTC. He was, but it wasn't him. That exchange was flagged for deletion. It wasn't. A scanning tech named Sherry left the auto-archive bot running too long and uploaded the pages to the public NASA server for 11 hours before someone noticed. Long enough for it to be downloaded, screen captured, and discussed on 24 conspiracy forums before breakfast. Quirky detail, the file was named A15 Hoppers Mask Res Truct Smile. No one knows what SMILE stood for, but it was later referenced in a training handbook for comms officers under the Do Not Discuss section, right next to tactile illusions and the voice loop irregularities. Speaking of voice loops, some of the released audio contained minor delays between what Astronaut said and what was recorded, but not the usual transmission delay. These were backwards. That is, the recording sometimes captured a word before it was spoken. An audio engineer reviewed the files and found that when reversed, one such loop contained a whisper. The whisper said, "Still listening. Now, let's step away from the void for a moment and talk about pizza." Yes, pizza. Because one of the Apollo 15 engineers, known for his habit of drawing doodles of pepperoni slices in margins, once left a strange sketch on a classified logbook, a slice of pizza floating over the moon, with the caption, "No anchovies, no shadows, no turning back." The logbook was confiscated. The engineer retired shortly after. His daughter, years later, claimed he used to mutter in his sleep, "It's not a dream if someone else is watching." NASA eventually removed the unredacted files. Replacements were uploaded with the usual thick black bars over anything interesting. But the leak had done its damage. And in 2011, a FOIA request for the mirror effect returned a curious denial. Record exists under classification threshold. Access not authorized at this time. In other words, we have it, but we're not letting it out. And that's the real mystery here. It's not that something weird happened during Apollo mission space is weird. It's that the same weird things kept happening, across different missions, different crews, different years. Always the same phrases, always the same silences afterward. Are we the dream or the dreamer? Are we echoes in a system that already knows how it ends? A systems analyst once proposed that deep space might act like a kind of mirror, not optical, but conceptual. That the longer you stare into the cosmos, the more likely it is to return something. Not light, not matter, just an idea. Something that thinks with you. So maybe that's what these unedited lines are. Not madness, not interference, just a reflection, a delayed thought, a murmured reply. And if that's true, maybe it's time we stop asking who's out there and start asking who's listening in here. On December 4th, 1985, a strange thing happened. NORAD's radar detected an object re-entering Earth's atmosphere. Nothing unusual about that space debris falls all the time, except this time, the object was immediately flagged as a space shuttle, which was confusing, because the next shuttle mission STS-61C hadn't launched yet. In fact, it was still sitting quietly on the launch pad in Florida, fully intact, not even fueled. The shuttle NORAD saw, it was re-entering at precisely the trajectory predicted for STS-61C's return, 3 weeks in the future. The official explanation: atmospheric distortion. The unofficial whisper: the shuttle arrived early. Let's pause for a sip of tea and a quirk. In 1985, the codename for STS-61C was Columbia Plus, and one of the backup payload specialists was a young congressional aide named Bill Nelson. He later became the NASA administrator, a man who once held his own launch schedule, and possibly watched himself land before takeoff. Back to the anomaly. The re-entry signature was clean identical mass profile, same heat signature, same telemetry bounce window. NORAD's system automatically generated a designation tag, STS-61C Mirror. Yes, mirror. That word again. No physical shuttle was found. No debris. Just a brief 3-minute radar track and a glitchy telemetry handshake that caused 3 monitors in the tracking center to blue screen. Simultaneously. This was before Windows. Mind you, these were military machines running Cold War code. They didn't crash easily. A day later, a technician in the Kennedy Space Center telemetry lab was reviewing the pre-launch systems feed for the upcoming shuttle flight when he noticed something weird. The data from the orbiter's onboard computer had a 5-second recording stored in its non-volatile memory. No one knew how it got there. The recording was simple. A distorted male voice, heavily processed, saying, "We did this already." Naturally, no one panicked. That would have been too reasonable. Instead, the file was scrubbed, and the systems were reset. The incident was logged as possible internal test artifact, which is bureaucratic for "we don't know," and "please don't ask again." But one engineer did ask again. His name was Luther Haynes, a software specialist with a passion for crossword puzzles and a tendency to hum Beethoven during launches. He copied the file, took it home on a floppy disk — you could do that in 1985, and ran it through a series of audio analysis programs. The final waveform contained a buried subharmonic frequency, not enough to hear, but enough to shape brain activity when played repeatedly. That's where things get truly strange. Haynes reported a dream that night. In it, he was sitting in mission control, watching a shuttle landing. Except the shuttle came in backward. No flames, no sound. Just a long, silent slide into the atmosphere, and it had no windows. Quirky fact. The Columbia orbiter used thermal tiles to withstand re-entry temperatures of up to 3,000 degrees. They had to be glued on by hand. Sometimes, those tiles fell off. During training, the adhesive used was codenamed Whisper Paste because it was soft enough to dampen vibration. One of the STS-61C engineers reported that, days before launch, several tiles were discovered missing, not fallen off, just not there, as if they'd already been used, already scorched. So now we stumble into one of the more unnerving debates in temporal mechanics looped causality, the idea that under extreme conditions, high velocity, gravitational distortion, and strong electromagnetic fields, an event might cause itself. In other words, the shuttle landed because it was scheduled to land. Then it launched to fulfill that prediction. It's less time travel, more time recursion, a self-fulfilling moment baked into the physics of high orbit. This wasn't the only incident. In 1991, a similar radar signature was logged, this time matching the return profile of STS-48. But the shuttle was still 4 days from launch. The radar record was classified under the code name Echo Return Sol. NASA never acknowledged these anomalies. But in a rare interview, astronaut Franklin Chang Diaz, who flew on STS-61C, was asked about the early return. He smiled and said, "You can't arrive early when time is the passenger." Not ominous at all. Franklin, later, a physicist at JPL, ran a simulation using orbital telemetry, solar radiation levels, and hypothetical tachyon dispersal fields. Yes, really. The model showed a 0.0034% probability of signal duplication via particle echo, but only if the object had already completed the orbit once before. Meaning for the shuttle to show up on radar, it would have had to have flown the mission from the future, then bounced its own signal backward through a plasma trail. That's the theory, anyway. So maybe what NORAD saw wasn't the shuttle. Maybe it was the memory of the shuttle. A heat signature left behind by its own future. A ghost of an orbit not yet traveled, but already decided. After the actual STS-61C mission landed safely, no anomalies were recorded. No one remembered anything strange, except for one astronaut who later joked during a reunion dinner. "I swear I saw a grease stain on the seat cushion during launch, like someone had been sitting there already." He laughed. No one else did. Let's say you're working the night shift at Mission Control. It's 2:43 a.m. The coffee's burned. Someone brought donuts, but only the powdered ones are left. And you're monitoring a live capsule feed because the flight director is asleep with a copy of Popular Mechanics on his face. Suddenly, something flickers in the video just for a moment. Not an astronaut, not equipment. Something in the corner. A shape. A blur. Something not on any manifest. And then someone in the room, the quiet guy in the back you never talk to, says he's back. This was the unofficial beginning of the Loop Watcher incident, and the man who refused to shut off the feed, a technician named Alan Becker, who went from quiet guy in the back to very interesting guy we transferred to a different department with no windows. It happened during a Skylab re-entry simulation in 1978. Just a training exercise, no live astronauts, just signal playback and systems diagnostics. The capsule wasn't even in orbit. It was in a warehouse. And yet, the feed flickered. For exactly 1.8 seconds. The screen showed a dark figure standing behind the command seat, unmoving. No suit, no faceplate, just watching. Becker refused to end the feed. The system flagged it as an operator override, which triggered a mild internal audit. In his statement, he wrote someone else was in the simulation. I saw them. When asked who, he replied, not who. When? Let's pause to appreciate how Becker low-level systems tech might have accidentally walked into one of the most classified wrinkles in NASA history. The figure never appeared again. The video file was lost in migration. But several engineers who were present that night confirmed that the feed did flicker, and that the override caused a minor surge in the telemetry buffer, an action that should have been impossible in a pre-recorded simulation. Quirky sidebar. The term Loop Watcher was coined by another technician who, during a later ISS feed review, saw a tiny silhouette reflected in a laptop screen that should have been off. He circled it on a printout, labeled it Loop Watcher, and taped it to the wall with a sticky note. Don't look twice. That sticky note vanished. The reflection never showed up again. But people started noticing anomalies in video footage, especially at timestamps ending in 43. Now here's where it gets weird. Becker didn't just refuse to shut off the feed. He copied it, on reel-to-reel tape, then mailed it to himself. A few weeks later, his apartment was broken into. Nothing stolen, except the tape. He told friends later that he still remembered the figure. Not menacing. He said, just patient, like someone waiting for us to catch up. His co-workers nicknamed him Mr. No, because whenever a supervisor told him to do something related to video playback, he'd respond, no, not until I'm sure who's watching who. Now, sir, about that promotion. You'd think disobeying a direct instruction and triggering a classified signal event would get you fired. But Becker was promoted. 2 pay grades up, reassigned to a division called React Echo, which doesn't officially exist. In fact, a FOIA request filed in 1999 received the following reply. React Echo is not an active program. No personnel records available. Inquiries into classified audiovisual materials should be directed to the Office of Signal Integrity. Translation. That program was real, and now it's not your business. Academic debate time in theoretical physics. There's a concept known as observer entanglement, where 2 entities share a quantum state and can influence each other's perceptions across time. Some suggest this could explain feedback loops in high isolation environments like space capsules or the backs of locked simulation rooms in Houston. Still with me? Because here's the final twist in 1984. Becker disappeared. Left his position. No retirement. No forwarding address. Just gone. But in 1993, a documentary filmmaker working on a piece about decommissioned NASA equipment purchased a bulk box of reel tapes from a surplus auction. One of the unlabeled tapes contained 47 minutes of static, then 5 words, whispered, low-pitched, repeated for 2 minutes. I saw you see it. When the filmmaker tried to digitize the tape, the reel caught fire. No joke. It literally burned. He now keeps the melted reel on a shelf in his office, under a plaque that reads, Loop Watcher's Last Broadcast. So what was the Loop Watcher? A reflection of future missions bleeding into the past, a glitch in simulated time, or just a man, standing quietly, waiting to make sure no one ever shuts off the feed too early. Because maybe the real mystery isn't what we see in space. Maybe it's who sees us first. In early 2004, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory was buzzing. The Mars rover Spirit had just landed. Humanity was about to start rolling across the red planet like it owned the place. Spirits were high. Engineers were sleep-deprived. Someone brought cupcakes. And then, without warning, the rover spoke. Not a sensor ping, not a telemetry squawk. An actual 3-second audio file transmitted from the surface of Mars. This was odd for 2 reasons. Spirit had no microphone. Mars doesn't transmit audio. The file, logged under the innocuous ID tag MRO-Data58-WAV, arrived during a standard data burst. It was small, corrupted, almost discarded. But a curious intern who will forever be known only as Mike clicked play before deleting it. What he heard chilled him so deeply, he later said he forgot how to swallow for a minute. The file was low resolution, distorted, but audible. It was a human voice. And it said, in heavily garbled English, "Wait, not yet. Not alone. Now." Let's be clear. No human had ever been to Mars. No broadcast of that phrase was ever sent. And yet, the waveform analysis showed no sign of duplication, compression artifact, or Earth-based reflection. It had originated from the surface. NASA's immediate response: pull the file. Flag it. Run an internal audit. The official report stated it was interference from Earth-based comms, but when Mike tried to access the file again later that afternoon, it was gone, deleted from the server. Even the system logs that would have tracked its existence were wiped. Mike, of course, had saved a copy. Interns are smart like that. He played it again at home, just once. The second time he tried, his speakers blew out with a low-frequency shriek that melted the wires in his headphones. He never opened it again. He still has the hard drive, though in a locked safe. Under a photo of the rover with the words, "Stay curious, but not that curious." True science fact. Mars has an atmosphere thin, yes, but technically capable of transmitting sound. It's just that sound travels differently there. Lower frequency, more muffled, which makes this file even stranger. The voice was perfectly audible, as if it had been recorded in Earth conditions. So now we wade into one of the weirdest areas of space science non-local entanglement of acoustic data. Or as one MIT researcher put it in a symposium no one attended, what if Mars didn't send a voice? What if we heard a voice that's been waiting there to be heard? This calls to mind a philosophical debate going back to the ancient Greeks. Do objects retain the memory of intention? Can a place remember who it's waiting for? Which brings us to a strange footnote from 1977. During the Viking 1 mission, one of the instruments returned an unexplainable telemetry packet. It was dismissed as random noise, but a technician who also played piano in a bar after work converted the packet into MIDI notes out of curiosity. The result, a short, eerie melody. The same melody was recognized 27 years later by Mike the intern, who had played that exact sequence during a middle school recital. He still has the sheet music. The piece is called Red Echo. Quirky detail, the name of the technician who translated the Viking signal into MIDI, Harold J. Belton. Yes, that Harold from the 5-second beep in Apollo 11. Apparently, space didn't let go of him either. After the Spirit voice file incident, JPL scrubbed all inbound audio data from its Mars missions, officially, to conserve bandwidth, unofficially, because a week after the file came in, a comms terminal began auto-playing a distorted version of the voice at 3:17 a.m. every night. Engineers replaced the system. New terminal, new ID, different room, same time, same voice. Wait, not yet. Not alone. Eventually, they disabled the speaker entirely. The voice continued this time as a vibration through the floor. People started moving their desks. Then one engineer, sleep-deprived and out of snacks, wrote it down on a whiteboard and added a second line. "We are already here." That board was quietly removed. But in a later team photo from the Spirit Project, the phrase can be seen faintly in the corner of the frame, half erased, like it didn't want to be remembered, but couldn't quite vanish. And what about Mike? He never worked in aerospace again. He became a sound designer for indie horror games. He once posted on an old forum, "Nothing we send out there goes unheard. Some things just take longer to answer. Some things are already answering back." He also noted that the original WAV file corrupted, and all had one final surprise when scanned with a spectrogram. The waveform formed a shape that looked uncannily like the NASA logo, except instead of the swooping red vector, a thin coiled spiral, like a question mark, or a microphone, or a mouth. On October 17, 2023, at precisely 2:11 Delta, or GMT, an unassigned, open comms channel on NASA's Deep Space Network sprang to life. It wasn't supposed to be active. The DSN Channel 43 was dormant, used years ago for Apollo telemetry backups, now relegated to archival overflow. But at that exact time, a transmission blinked on. It lasted 19 seconds, and it began with, "This is Commander Ilian. Mission clock T-minus 4384 days. Authorization code, Orion 6 Zeta." The problem, there was no Commander Ilian listed in any NASA flight crew past, present, or planned. And the Orion capsule program hadn't launched any manned missions yet. Not officially. The voice was calm. American accent. Late 30s. Male. Clipped cadence like someone trained to speak on air. The message was short, but surgical. Confirm status of Earthside signal relay. Repeat confirm status. Mission returning through non-linear vector. No contact with temporal anchor. Current Earth year presumed 2023. Stand by for physical re-entry. Then silence. NASA's official reaction, complete denial. Internal systems didn't log the transmission. No record of that channel being active. No anomalies noted, but a few listening stations, hobbyists, amateur astronomers, and one guy in Iowa with a homemade dish array and an unusual number of Mountain Dew bottles captured it. They uploaded the audio. NASA issued quiet takedown requests within the day, but once it's on the internet, it's everywhere. The phrase that stuck out, "No contact with temporal anchor." That's not standard NASA phrasing. That's philosophy meets physics. It implies the astronaut believed he had slipped accidentally or intentionally out of time. A few fringe researchers call this the Icarus window, a theorized condition where craft traveling at high velocity through specific gravitational zones might punch through to non-linear segments of the space-time lattice. Try saying that at a party and see how fast people switch tables. But the voice, whoever he was, knew mission codes. New systems lingo. One aerospace analyst who worked on early Orion prototypes listened to the file and turned pale. He listed a code we hadn't even deployed yet. It was proposed, internal use only. Now for your quirky tidbit, one of the engineers on the 2021 Artemis Systems team, an amateur poet, once joked that time would be the biggest mission risk. She pinned a sticky note to her monitor that read, "Avoid quantum jet lag. Remember where you parked." That sticky note was found in a different building 4 months later, still stuck to the same monitor. But back to Commander Ilian. The most unnerving part, several lines of his speech overlapped with phrasing from Apollo training manuals. Manuals classified until the mid-1980s. Word-for-word echoes of sections on signal degradation and crew isolation. And the name Ilian, it shows up in a different file, an old, heavily redacted memo from the 1990s about time dilation effects observed during simulated deep space exposure, using high-frequency stroboscopic immersion. The memo references Subject I, alien, as having residual predictive cognition during REM cycles. Whatever that means. It made the line. Mission returning through nonlinear vector even creepier. Was it the same alien? A future one? A past one? Or just a name a time-lost astronaut borrowed from an echo? NASA never commented on the voice. But a week later, Channel 43 received a second ping. Not a voice this time, just data. A short string of binary code, when converted using standard ASCII translation, read 0312 UTC. Window opens again. That timestamp showed up before, in Part 9, the carousel music incident aboard the ISS. 0312 UTC. The moment the station hummed a lullaby no one installed. The moment something listened back. That time across all our records keeps showing up. And then there's the last file. The one someone tried to bury. A screenshot from a comms terminal leaked by an unknown insider. Watermarked C430's log Delta shows a new entry. Text only, no audio. Returning. System reboot in 7 minutes. Tell them not to answer next time. It listens for replies. NASA has since sealed off Channel 43 entirely. Not decommissioned. Not deleted. Just sealed. Locked behind credentials no current staff claim to own. The name of the security protocol. Echolochial, so maybe that's where we are now. Maybe a voice from the future got through. Maybe he wasn't calling for help. Maybe he was trying to stop us from answering too soon. Because it's one thing to get a call from the future. It's another thing entirely to pick up. His name was Emery Till, and he didn't believe in ghosts. Not the creaky floor kind. Not the sheet-over-the-head Halloween kind. And especially not the kind that whispered through comm loops at odd hours of the night. Emery was a contractor. Old school. A pencil behind the ear. Coffee by the gallon kind of guy. He worked for a third-party aerospace archival firm contracted to digitize NASA's cold storage reels. His job? Listen to hundreds of hours of old space mission audio, catalog anomalies, and flag anything containing non-standard signal events. He found over 400. He logged them all. Labeled, time-stamped, cross-referenced. Made a spreadsheet with columns like ghost breath, whispers in dead channels, mirrored dialogue, loop speech, and, ominously, unknown speaker ID. He didn't speculate, didn't editorialize, just observed. And then, one day, he stopped. In the middle of a file labeled STS-105 AUX midpass, his notes end abruptly with the words, confirmed. They were never talking to us. Then nothing. No calls. No resignation. His workstation was powered down, badge left in the tray, desk drawer locked. Authorities opened it 3 weeks later and found 3 things. A single reel labeled Echo Anchor, 0 as a 1. A stack of printed transcripts with sections highlighted in red ink. A handwritten note. Not ghosts. Not interference. They were always in the room. We just finally got quiet enough to hear them. His archive, later dubbed the Till Vault, contained not only logs, but personal margin notes where he'd mused quietly, dryly, sometimes angrily. Apollo 12 whisper said, "Try again," before transmission even started. Gemini 5, someone breathing into an open mic, no one on comms. STS-51L, 1 second of laughter before launch. Source unknown. He even noted patterns. So 3, Huawei 12 UTC. Echoes during EVA. Astronauts repeating exact phrases years apart. The most bizarre. He compiled a list of phrases that appeared 3 or more times across decades. Missions. And crew. It already happened. Don't say yes. Still watching? Not the dreamer. She's not in the mirror anymore. The signal answered itself. Some were typed. Others were handwritten. One was etched, quietly and deeply, into the wooden underside of his desk. This is the last story. Till's final audio submission was never officially received. But 2 years later, a private collector of space memorabilia claimed to have purchased a sealed envelope from an estate sale in Nevada. Inside, a USB stick, 2 cassette tapes, and a folded sheet of paper that read, "Play when alone, preferably near water." The USB contained one file, a filtered loop of the Apollo 17 mirror incident, layered under the carousel lullaby from ISS logs. When played at half speed, the phrase "We see her too" becomes "We see you now." No one's sure what was on the tapes. The collector claims he returned them to NASA. NASA says they've never heard of the collector. Standard. But here's the thing. After Till vanished, no one took over his role. The position remained open, unfilled, until NASA's contract with the archival firm quietly expired. The access database Till built meticulous, obsessively tagged, was copied once, burned to Blu-ray, and placed in a fireproof box in a government records facility in Virginia. Its internal code, Mirror Vault Till, its current status sealed. So what did Emery Till uncover? He didn't think it was aliens. He didn't think it was time travel. What he wrote in the final margin of his final page was this: "They are not from another place. They are from this one, from when it was louder, from when it remembered us better. And we astronauts, dreamers, engineers just happened to brush past their frequency." Maybe that's what all these anomalies were. Not warnings, not threats, just echoes. Memories of things trying to be remembered. Trying to listen back. Trying to reach through. Because maybe, in all our attempts to explore the stars, we woke something that was never sleeping. So now, here we are. At the end of a long, echo-filled trail through whispered transmissions and ghost signals in the night. Maybe none of this was real. Maybe it's all misheard static and sleepy engineers seeing faces in shadows. But maybe not. Maybe space isn't just out there, it's in here, too. In the flicker of a headset, the hum of a cooling fan, the creak of a chair when no one's sitting in it. Maybe we haven't been alone in the dark. Maybe we've just been on mute. And when the frequency drifts just right, maybe we hear the ones who've been listening all along. No monsters, no invaders. Just echoes. So check your radio before you sleep. If something hums back, maybe don't answer. Just let it pass. Let it fade. Let it listen.